Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a la Conferencia Internacional por la Libertad Académica hacia la creación de estándares internacionales. Soy el profesor David Gómez Gamboa, director de Aula Abierta. Para el público hispanohablante habrá una guía de textos en castellano disponible en el chat de este Zoom. On behalf of Aula Abierta Open Class NGO, Special Rapporteurship on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights, SIM of Utrecht University, the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, and the human rights bodies of University of Zulia, University of Los Andes, Central University of Venezuela, Andrés Bello Catholic University, Metropolitan University, and every institution that supports this conference. Welcome everybody to the online conference on academic freedom towards the development of international standards. I would like to welcome the honorable rapporteurs from the United Nations, Mr. Clement Boulet and Mr. Ahmed Shahed, and from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Ms. Flavia Piovesan, Soledad Garcia Muñoz, and the distinguished professors and academics from Latin America, Europe, the Americas in general, and Asia that will share with us. I would also like to thank every one of you for joining us and being here with us today and tomorrow. Before we get started, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to those who kindly collaborate with us to make this event possible, especially to Professor Antoine Buyse, Director of the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights at Utrecht University, Ms. Professor Mariela Morales Antoniazzi, Senior Researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. And also, I would like to thank our allied institutions that support the International Conference on Academic Freedom in Venezuela, but also in Latin America. This international event will bring together special rapporteurs, members of the United Nations and Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, representatives of academic institutes, professors from universities in Latin America, Europe, Asia, North America, students, members of the university community, and civil society in general. By making visible the importance of the human right of academic freedom through this event, we aim to demand urgent attention from the states, international human rights bodies, and the international community in general. You can expect each speaker to have the floor for about 10 minutes. I will be grateful to respect the time, whereafter we will conduct a short questions and answers cycle at the end of each session. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window. We will address them during the questions and answers round. Also, I would like to remind the participants that there will be a certificate of participation for those who attend the international conference on both days, today and tomorrow. I would like to thank my co-host, Professor Maida Hocheva, Director of the Human Rights Observatory of University of Los Andes, and Professor Ricardo Villalobos. Now I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Ricardo Villalobos Fontalvo, who is professor at the University Rafael Urdaneta in Venezuela and coordinator of research and international advocacy of Aula Abierta. Currently, Ricardo is conducting a master's degree at ETSET University in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, the international conference is here, and we have to say that this is an inflection point in the work of civil society organizations for the recognition of academic freedom as a human rights issue. This conference is the formal kickoff in a set of activities that will lead to the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom. It is worthy to mention that the conference was designed to make visible and to reinforce all the work that Aula Abierta, together with our allies, have been doing since 2014, while promoting academic freedom as a human right. And this can be visualized in the following points. First, the conference is a space to reinforce the work of building what we call university social tissue that we have been developing in the region through our Latin American network of scholars for academic freedom. Just an example, or just as a reference, we are having in this conference the participation of more than 30 academics, human rights defenders, and academic institutions that are actively engaged in the defense of academic freedom in Latin America, but also in other regions of the world. Secondly, this conference makes visible the work of documenting violations of academic freedom that Aula Abierta's Latin American Observatory for Academic Freedom has been issued. In this observatory, we have issued more than 20 reports among the years. Each thematic axis of the conference reflects the research lines and the intersectional approach of the Latin American Observatory for Academic Freedom on the topic. Finally, the conference also reinforced our work in human rights education and international advocacy, since the flagship message of our cause is ratified throughout each of the panels. Academic freedom is a human right, and as such, its exercise is fundamental for democracy and for the exercise of other rights, both civil and political, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. However, I think the major contribution of this conference lies in its contribution to the normative evolution of academic freedom and international human rights law. Over the next 2 days, discussions will be taking place that will directly fit the process of creating the first international standards on academic freedom generated by an international body, in this case, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. All have been said, it is my pleasure then to turn the floor over our first speaker of the day, Professor Mayda Hochevar. As you said, she's the director of the Human Rights Observatory of University of Los Andes. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Ricardo. Today we are presenting the discussion panel, International Standards on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, a Pending Commitment. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your chat and we will bring them up at the end. Now I will give the floor to Professor David Gómez Gamboa. David Gómez Gamboa is a university professor, general director of Aula Abierta, and coordinator of the Human Rights Commission of the University of Zulia. His talk will be on patterns of violations of academic freedom in Latin America, pending challenges in the jurisprudence of the International Court. You have the floor now, David.
Thank you, Mayda. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to talk about the threats to academic freedom in Latin America according with the work that Aula Abierta have developed through the Observatory of Academic Freedom in Latin America. Please, if the slides can be shared, por favor, compartir las láminas de PowerPoint, por favor. Muchas gracias. La primera, por favor. First, academic freedom is a human right that finds its grounds in international law, but it needs a broader protection. Quoting the Lima Declaration, academic freedom means the freedom of members of the academic community, individually or collectively, in the pursuit, development, and transmission of knowledge through research, study, discussion, documentation, production, creation, teaching, lecturing, and writing, and please take into consideration inside the universities, but also outside the universities. Academic freedom is recognized in international law, but as I mentioned before, it needs a broader protection. Articles 13 and 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights regulates the matter. The General Comment 13 on the right to education of the United Nations Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in its paragraph 38, 39, 40, refers to the scope of academic freedom and the instrumental role of the autonomy of the higher education institutions to guarantee thereof. The General Comment 25th of the Science and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights by the committee, the same committee, in its paragraph 45th, refers to the obligation to fulfill academic freedom by states. Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also regulates the freedom of expression, but it is connected with academic freedom. But I would like to emphasize the importance of some reports from the international human rights bodies. For example, the ones from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, or the report which linked academic freedom and freedom of expression produced by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression of the United Nations, presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2020, some months ago. On the other hand, I would like to share some of the main concerns regarding threats and restrictions on academic freedom in Latin America, which were documented by our NGO, Aula Abierta, Open Class NGO, through its Latin American Observatory on Academic Freedom. Please, por favor, la siguiente lámina. The first pattern is retaliations against academicians for disseminating information about the coronavirus pandemic. La siguiente lámina, por favor. In Venezuela, on May 2020, the president of the National Constituent Assembly threatened members of the Academy of Physics, Mathematics, and Natural Sciences for the academic report, warning about a possible increase in number of cases. La siguiente lámina, por favor. In Nicaragua, the director of the Center for Health Researches at UNAM Managua and 3 of his colleagues were dismissed by authorities of the university after they stated some concerns about the COVID-19. I would like to highlight the relationship between academic freedom and other human rights, such as the right to health, for example. Without the reports and opinions based on scientific knowledge, societies will be more vulnerable, for example, to coronavirus. The second pattern, la siguiente lámina, por favor, is reprisals against scholars due to their academic research. In Cuba, the university professor and biologist Ariel Ruiz Urquiola was expelled from the Marine Research Center of the University of La Habana in 2016 due to his critic environmental work against the Cuban government. In August of 2019, the Cuban Vice Minister of Higher Education threatened all professors who don't follow the party's revolutionary policies, the morality and the ideology of the Cuban Revolution. In Venezuela, the professor at the University of Carabobo, Santiago Guevara, for example, was arbitrarily detained in 2017 and brought before military courts after publishing articles on the economic situation in the country. In the framework of his trial, the prosecutor presented his books and academic publications as an evidence of his crimes. La siguiente, por favor. However, scholars are not only attacked because of their scientific research. They also, as university authorities, face attacks due to their participation in the discussion of public affairs. Unfortunately, attacks intensified in Latin America during recent years. In Venezuela, for example, in 2019, a legal document was issued by the National Council of Universities, which requested to initiate a criminal inquiry against the rectors, members of the University Rectors Associations, for not recognizing the de facto government of Nicolás Maduro. This pattern has been documented also in Bolivia, with threats and violence against the rector of the San Andrés Major University, in that time, Waldo Albarracin, in 2019, or, for example, in Nicaragua, against the rector of the Central American University, José Idiáquez. Universities represent the cradle of scientific knowledge. They should defend the rule of law and democracy. The scope of academic freedom should include the protection of participation of scholars, authorities, researchers, professors, but also students when they are advocating in favor of democracy. La siguiente lámina, por favor. The next pattern is criminalization of university actors, scholars, or students who protest, reprisals for participating in the discussion of public affairs. In 2009, former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chávez, gave orders to police and military forces to violently repress students on the streets in Venezuela when they would protest. He said, use against students the most powerful tear gas, gas del bueno en español. Unfortunately, violence is often repeated in Latin America through practices from police, military, and some cases, parastatal groups. Between 2017 and 2020, our Observatory on Academic Freedom in Latin America documented within Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that over 450 university students have been arbitrarily detained during social protests. Also, more than 100 university students have been expelled from the universities. At least 30 students have been murdered and many others have been wounded, subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment for exercising their role as critical thinkers and their right to demonstrate. The development of critical thinking is necessary in both kinds of societies, those which are controlled by authoritarian regimes, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela, and the ones which live in democracy as well. Both scientific knowledge generated through the scientific method and critical debate in academic discussions inside or outside the universities should always be made possible and be welcome. Siguiente lámina, por favor. The next pattern is the expulsion, arbitrary dismissal, and other retaliations. Siguiente lámina, por favor. As a practice of discrimination on political grounds or after advocating human rights. Aula Abierta Open Class NGO documented several cases in Nicaragua and Venezuela, for example. In Colombia, Professor Mónica Godoy was fired from the University of Ibagué in 2017 for reporting violence against women. Fortunately, the Colombian Constitutional Court ruled supporting Mónica Godoy's human rights. La siguiente lámina, por favor. The next pattern is censorship in the dissemination and discussion of documentaries or contents inside the university campuses and self-censorship after threats. In Venezuela, for example, the ban on the analysis of the documentary film Chavism, the Plague of the 21st Century was notable. In 2019, a criminal court in Caracas prohibited its dissemination within the University Simón Bolívar, and after, the ban was applied for different universities and any other public space, restricting to discuss inside the universities it through academic dissertations. La siguiente lámina, por favor. The next pattern is indirect violations of academic freedom. In 2020, Aula Abierta, Open Class NGO, documented general reductions in the public budget allocated to traditional autonomous universities in 7 countries in Latin America in the context of COVID-19. Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, and Venezuela were documented. For 2021, the budget deficit of main universities in Venezuela, for example, reaches the 97%. Only the 3% of the requested amount by universities was finally approved by the government. We also denounced the siege against universities from several authorities in Venezuela, having registered, for example, more than 50 judicial decisions since 2010 against the autonomy of the universities. La siguiente lámina, por favor. The next pattern is restrictions on university autonomy through the imposition of legal standards. Notably, for example, in Cuba, the reform of higher education restricted the autonomy of universities since 1962. In Venezuela, for example, the Organic Law of Education and the Plan de la Patria, which is the socialist plan for economic and social development of the nation, subordinates academic activity to an ideology. In Mexico, between 2017 and 2020, Aula Abierta documented at least 9 law proposals from federal and local Mexican authorities against the autonomy of the universities. And the last pattern, la siguiente lámina, por favor, is attacks and structural damage to university campuses, some of them as consequence of incidents of insecurity. You can see some pictures, por favor compartir las siguientes 3 láminas, on the slides of the Oceanographic Institute at the Central University, at the Central Library of the University of Oriente in Venezuela, destroyed by vandalic acts. You can see the roof infrastructure of one of the main campuses at University Central of Venezuela after collapse as well. This is the library of the University of Oriente after the vandalic acts. This is the roof of one of the campuses of the Central University of Venezuela, which was declared a heritage of the mankind by the UNESCO. I would like to conclude, la siguiente lámina, por favor, doing a quick reference on the pending challenges in the case law of Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I would like to highlight that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression in October of 2020 highlighted in the report that I mentioned before the special role that academics and universities play for democracy. Among its recommendations, it was requested to international organizations and monitoring bodies to take a leading role to guarantee the protection of academic freedom. Unfortunately, to date, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has not developed case law on the right to academic freedom. This is a challenge, despite the fact that it has heard emblematic cases related to the matter, such as, for example, the case of Daniel Urrutia versus Chile. It is expected that the Inter-American Court could assume the establishment of the right to academic freedom as a right expressly protected by the Inter-American system as a pending challenge in new cases. So a general recommendation is to promote this, to develop a strategic litigation before domestic and international human rights bodies based on academic freedom arguments. The key role is on human rights NGOs and university human rights institutes to develop this task. To finish, I want to say that universities as centers of knowledge production and critical thinking are targets of authoritarian governments. However, academic freedom is also at risk in democratic societies. Without critical universities, democracy and development are not possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for your excellent presentation. I think that's related to the right to health and academic freedom. We have now the recently published observation on right to science that precisely connect several fundamental rights to academic freedom. And I think it's also a tool very helpful. Well, now I will give the floor to Professor Antoine Buyse. Antoine Buyse is professor and director of the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights at Utrecht University. He will talk about the situation of academic freedom in the Netherlands and the Utrecht Declaration of Academic Freedom.
Thank you very much, and good day to everyone. And also on behalf of our center, SIM in the Netherlands, welcome to the conference. I would like to start with a quote. Freedom of thought requires the defense of all thinking and honest people. These are words written in 1968 by one of the most famous dissidents of all time, Andrei Sakharov, protesting repression in his country, the former Soviet Union. He continued, and I quote again, "It is the only guarantee against an infection of people by mass myth, which in the hands of treacherous hypocrites and demagogues can be transformed into bloody dictatorship." End of quote. These lines mark the start of his own shift from academic to dissidence when he began to defend political prisoners and in the end became one himself. Now, Sakharov's words from 1968 seem to have lost nothing of their relevance now in 2021. Freedom and human rights in general have in the last decade come under increasing pressure, and you have just heard some examples already of that. And academic freedom is no exception. Sakharov got into trouble with the authorities because he stepped outside the ivory tower of academia. He was a physicist who had helped to develop the hydrogen bomb for the Soviet Union, and because he engaged with injustice in society. And indeed, the fiercest debates do not only happen between professors and students within academia, but also with the work beyond that to much wider audiences. And there are, of course, different degrees to this. From open and vocal dissidence with and criticism of powers that be, like state authorities, to the very simple sharing of academic knowledge in the media when being asked to do so, and everything in between that. From taking clear positions in societal debates and political debates to the mere speaking about one's own expertise, like medical experts have done very often in the past year of the pandemic. But what they all have in common is that as soon as academics either study politically or socially sensitive issues, or when they speak out about them, they can and will very often face pressure or even worse. What I will do today is to approach the topic of academic freedom from the perspective of the Netherlands, where I am based, and the thinking about academic freedom in my country. And I will do that in the full realization and full awareness that, well, of course, also in my country, academics face pressures. These are by no means as severe as many of the other examples you have already heard, and you will also hear in the coming 2 days from academics elsewhere. In the Netherlands, there are luckily no imprisoned academics, there are no murdered academics, and they are not in that bad of a position, relatively speaking. So I would like you to listen to my story with that caveat in mind, to give you some insights on pressures on academia in the Netherlands. I will do so on the basis of a recent report of the Royal Academy of Sciences of the Netherlands, and I will tell you about some examples as well. And I will end my contribution by telling you about an initiative on academic freedom that was adopted at my home university, Utrecht University, exactly 5 years ago. But first, the situation in the Netherlands. In 2018, so this was far before the pandemic, the Royal Academy of Sciences noted that there were no indications that scientists in the Netherlands were exercising any self-censorship or that they were limited in the opinions that they could express, but that there was still a need for some vigilance. So there was already a little bit of concern. For example, they noted that there is a growing emphasis on research that is not completely free, but that should very much be socially relevant. And now, about 3 years later, we have arrived in quite a different, much more polarized debate, a much more polarized situation as well. And I think we have seen this in almost every country on earth. Main medical academics, for example, who participated in public debate and advised government on measures to combat COVID-19, have become targets of online verbal threats, similar and parallel to the ones that David Gamboa was just telling us about in Latin America. The same happened here, and also some death threats were uttered. Very recently, this week, for example, in Belgium, the main medical expert was threatened by a military. So these words of very harsh critique on academics coming from society may sometimes also lead to very dangerous action following on the words. But let me give you 3 examples of the luckily not that severe pressures, but which face academics in the Netherlands. First, there's an example of last year where academics who do research into the extreme right have found posters and stickers on their personal homes, on their houses, on their family homes, which stated on the sticker, "This location is being observed by an organization called Targeting the Left. Please report leftist activism." This was the text on the stickers. And several of the academics who underwent this felt very threatened and went to the police, and also their university spoke out against these indirect threats. And I should also note here that these kind of threats, both in real life but also online on the social media, have a very clear gender dimension. So it's already found that female academics seem to be targeted relatively much more and much more harshly by online trolls. A second example on a very different type of on academic freedom and the threats to it is economic and financial. What to do when funding is needed for research and there is an external funder, but that funder itself is quite contested. A colleague of mine here in the law school in Utrecht wanted to do research into the smuggling of cigarettes and tobacco across borders. And he found funding for this by a private foundation, which was set up by Philip Morris, a big tobacco producer. And as soon as that became known, he was heavily criticized also from colleagues within his own university, from the medical department, which said, how on earth can you take money from cigarette producers, whereas we as a university should try to improve the health of people, not make it worse. And in the end, the outcry and the scandal was so big that the funding from the private funder was refused, and the university decided to pay for the research itself. And that shows how difficult the situation can sometimes be if there's lack of funding and academics have to look beyond the university for funding. And another example of that is funding is given by not private funders, but by other states. We have had several problems in the Netherlands when professorial chairs were funded by China, which were about Chinese culture and language and politics, where in one case it was found that the person selected had to sign a contract that she could not talk about too critically about China. So this is again an example of a funder that sets conditions, which may be quite problematic. I think someone else's name is very big in the screen now, so I don't know if that matters. Now, all of those types of pressures in academia triggered a study by the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. And in a report on academic freedom, which they published this year, which is kind of a think piece, they highlighted a number of things on academic freedom. And I would like to highlight 2 key observations. One observation they made in the report is that academic freedom, just like most other human rights, is not absolute. It is not unlimited. And this means that academic freedom is mostly limited by professional standards of academic practice. For example, honesty, transparency, independence, responsibility, etc. In other words, academic freedom does not allow for an abuse of your own position as an academic or scientist, for example, by falsifying data or conducting yourself in an unethical manner. In other words, scientists should do their work by taking into account the interests of the people they work with, of society at large, and of the environment. And this is connected to a second key observation, and that is that rights come with responsibilities. Now, this may sound like a cliche, like an open door, but it is, of course, the case also for academic freedom. And this doesn't just hold for the academics themselves, it also brings responsibilities for others. It brings responsibilities for the universities. They can set broad research agendas, but they should not interfere with the very small details of how their staff conducts the research. So they should also protect their academics against external coercion and external pressure. Secondly, there's obviously also responsibilities for states, for governments to respect academic freedom, not to interfere with it disproportionately, and only to restrict it when there's a legal basis, a legitimate aim, and when it is necessary. So these are, of course, the standard human rights criteria. But it also is a positive obligation for states to enable academic freedom, including by creating stable conditions of funding, which is an issue in almost every country. And finally, there's also responsibilities for all of us in our different capacity as citizens, but also for businesses, for civil society, because cooperation between academics and others is, of course, good to increase the societal relevance of research, but it also carries dangers of influence. So when funding research, external parties should respect academic freedom. They can ask academics to do commissioned research, but they cannot steer, and they should not steer, the expected or desired outcomes. And they should, of course, be transparent in what they fund and to what extent. So as you can see from this very, very short snapshot of what the Dutch Royal Academy wrote in its report, there's a number of areas of concern, and they all relate to broader tensions around power in every society. Now, all these issues are relevant for all academics, for all scholars, but I think they are particularly important, and I know there's many of us in this conference today, to human rights academics. After all, human rights academics study the degree to which rights, including academic freedom itself, are violated or respected. And very often human rights scholars participate in societal debates, are active in civil society next to their academic work, and our chair who organizes the conference today is a good example of that. And both by the content of what we research, as well as by these other activities, we very often face direct threats to academic freedom because we speak out about things. And we know all the more that in that context, solidarity and forging strong connections between ourselves really can help to protect each other. And this is why exactly 5 years ago, in 2016, we decided to speak out. And we, in this case, is the Global Association of Human Rights Institutes, also known as ARI, of which I'm a board member. My own institute, SIM, the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights in Utrecht, organized a big ARI conference in 2016. And that was the time when some universities, like Central European University in Hungary, faced closure, when a lot of Turkish academics after the failed coup d'etat were fired and imprisoned. And we just, at that moment, felt the need to draft a short and clear so-called Utrecht Declaration on Academic Freedom. And what did we include in that? Well, we built on the earlier Lima Declaration on Academic Freedom and Autonomy of Institutions of Higher Education, which is a document from 1988. And we stressed that academic freedom is a fundamental element of vibrant democracies. So again, this link with democracy that David Gamboa also made. And we pointed to many instances of intimidation and oppression of researchers, teachers, but also of students, which violate their human rights. And we underlined that this oppression can generate a climate of fear, which suffocates creative and critical thinking. And this can go at great cost of not just the current generation, but also of future generations. And I think the whole debates around COVID-19 in the past year in all countries have really showed us how crucial scientific knowledge and free debate and information is. We simply cannot do without it if we want to tackle humanity's challenges effectively. So in 2016, in that Utrecht Declaration, we called upon fellow academics, but also authorities at all levels to take a stand against attacks to academic freedom. And we handed the first copy to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, of course, these kind of nice words and declarations adopted by academics will not change the world. We are not naive, but words do matter, and solidarity voiced explicitly does matter too. For us at SIM, at Utrecht University, the words in the declaration are not just an empty promise. And for example, for many years, we have been involved in a shelter city program, which shelters human rights defenders in the Netherlands from all across the globe. And this is in fact how we got to know David Gamboa of Aula Abierta, the main organizer of this very conference. And I congratulate you again, David, for bringing us all together virtually across the Atlantic today and tomorrow. And this is also why in this year, when my institute has its 40th anniversary, we decided to be the co-organizer of this important event. And it's great to see how many civil society organizations, universities, international rapporteurs and organizations are cooperating for these 2 days. And that's, to me, another reflection of the academic solidarity that I was just talking about. So I would really like to end with congratulating David and his colleagues for bringing us virtually together. Hopefully all ties will be strengthened and new ties will be forged. For let us never forget that, like many other human rights, academic freedom is not just an individual right, but it is strengthened when applied and protected together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Antoine Buyse, for your presentation. I just would like to mention in Venezuela the case of Professor Andrés Zabrowski. He flew from the Soviet Union and came to University of Venezuela in the past century. And later he went to the US and he wrote a book called Murder of Science. He said that in Russia, science was murdered by the state and that he had to be a follower of communism instead of a servant to science. He said also that a scientific idea which has perished with the brain of its creator is usually lost for the world forever. So now I will give the floor to Ricardo Villalobos. Ricardo Villalobos is professor at the Rafael Urdaneta University, is coordinator of the research and international advocacy of Aula Abierta. He will talk on international advocacy on academic freedom.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about international advocacy on academic freedom. I would like to ask if it's possible exactly to just reproduce my slides. Great. So I would like to ask then to move to the second slide, if it's possible. Great. Ángel Manfredo Velázquez Rodríguez, a university student who was forced to disappear by the state because his critical opinions against the dictatorship in Honduras back in the 1980s. His fight was not in vain. This tragic situation led to the landmark case of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in which it found the state of Honduras responsible of breaching its international obligations regarding the American Convention on Human Rights. Most notably, it set the legal framework to hold accountable states for committing forced disappearances, a common practice of the dictatorships to eradicate critical thinkers in those days, such as university students. For many, as Professor Palacios Zualaga, this case changed not only the history of the Inter-American system. We need to say that it was the very first merit ruling of the court history, but also shaped what we understand nowadays by the obligations of the state within the international human rights law. Could anything be more related to democracy than the systems designed to protect the human rights? If we had more time, I could mention other similar cases from different regions of the world. But this case illustrates how scholars and students have always been part of the fight for the rule of law. Could we move to the next slide, please? Despite the inherent connection between scholars, democracy, and academic freedom, very little attention had been given to the latter by the international human rights bodies until a couple of years ago. This reality was identified with concern a few years ago when in Venezuela we documented how students and university professors were victims of human rights violations during the 2014 protests. Many students denounced even that the police tortured them more severely when they found out that they were students. In 2017, this trend continued. At least 339 students and 17 professors were arbitrarily detained. Many of them were brought before military courts. The fact that scholars and students were one of the main targets of governmental reprisals showed the key role of the academic's critical opinion for democratic societies. Unfortunately, reprisals against academia, because its criticisms against human rights violations and democracy have been also documented in other countries in Latin America, such as Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia, and of course, in other countries in the world. Could we move to the next slides, please? As a way to address this challenge, a group of scholars, students, non-governmental organizations, and university human rights centers have been advocated for academic freedom as a human rights issue. Could we move to the next slide, please? Aula Abierta, together with several organizations and scholars, which are all present in this conference, has issued more than 30 reports on academic freedom and other human rights of scholars, has deployed several advocacy strategies, such as requesting and participating at least in 7 public hearings before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, as well as advocating in the framework of the General Assemblies of the United Nations and the Organization of American States. Fortunately, this work has been successful. Can we move to the next slides, please? Progressively, international human rights bodies have been issuing concerns about the academic freedom situation. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has issued at least 2 reports showing concern on the harassment against university students and professors, as well as universities authorities in Venezuela. More recently, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression issued a report on the situation of academic freedom in the world. Can we move to the next slides, please? There you can see in the screen the cover of these reports that I was mentioning, in which these human rights bodies issue several concerns about the situation of academic freedom. But perhaps the most notable advances in academic freedom protection are found in the Inter-American system. The Inter-American Commission has recognized in its country reports for Venezuela and Nicaragua, for instance, that academic freedom and university autonomy are essential to the enjoyment of the right to education, but most important, to democratic societies. Moreover, the Inter-American Commission has held at least 7 public hearings where academic freedom was issued since 2017. The biggest milestone was the public hearing about academic freedom and the autonomy of the higher education institutions in the Americas, in the framework of the 171 period of sessions, where the Inter-American Commission recognized the need to create inter-American standards to properly protect academic freedom in the region. That means the general standards are not enough to protect this right. And fortunately, this has been ratified by the commissioners in the following periods, such as the 175 and the 177 period of sessions. Could we go to the next slide, please? Or at least return 2 slices. Then can you press Can you press play? In the slides where you can see David, that's a video. So if you press play, we can see the video. Okay, I'm going to send through the chat in sake of time. I'm going to send through the chat the link of the video so we don't waste the time in this presentation. But basically the video is related to brief or maybe a resume of all the participations in the public hearings before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And it's worthy to mention that in the last part of the video, you can see how Esmeralda Troitiño de Arosemeda, which was the former commissioner of and president of the Inter-American Commission, in the 171 period of session, she recognized the need to create inter-American standards on academic freedom. So everything that we have discussed is evidence. And regarding this evidence, it's undeniable that academic freedom is in the agenda of international human rights bodies and has started to shape some international and domestic dynamics. One example is the very conference that gathers us today, in which we are discussing the theoretical framework that is going to contribute in the elaboration of the first set of principles of academic freedom by an international human rights body. I just want to mention this phrase that Professor Antoine mentioned a few minutes ago. And yes, the solidarity and the participation of all scholars, but also human rights defenders, has made possible that nowadays we are towards the realization of one important goal, which is to have international standards adopted by an international body, helping and giving light in what do we need to understand about academic freedom and its relation, not only as a self-standing right in an individual dimension, but also, as he mentioned, in a collective dimension. So I would like to conclude by reinforcing the idea that academic freedom is a human right. Without academic freedom and universities, we cannot have democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ricardo, for your presentation. I would like to invite you to follow Aula Abierta Open Class in social media at Aula Abierta V, at Libertad Académica, and I would like to invite you to visit our websites, aulaabiertavenezuela.org, derechosuniversitarios.org, and libertadacademica.org. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor José Gustavo Prieto, an Ecuadorian professor. Gustavo Prieto is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of European, Public and International Law at the University of Gent. His topic is about constitutional courts and the creation of common standards on academic freedom, reflections on the inter-American system, continuing the debate in this discussion panel on international standards on academic freedom and university autonomy, a pending commitment. So thank you very much, Professor Gustavo Prieto. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, David. Can you hear me well? Yep. So, well, I want to start obviously by thank you for the opportunity to being here. Actually, it's actually a unique event and a unique research agenda that you're doing, and all the people that they're actually making Aula Abierta. And I see in general this because usually it takes a lot of time to assemble one of these events, but what I want to highlight is the dedication that you have devoted to this project in the last years, and in a way it touches the vibe of what actually is academic freedom, when many times for the things that people from Aula Abierta are writing, they eventually can get in some kind of troubles for when they are confronted with especially authoritarian regimes. And I think that probably that's a good start of my presentation. Is something is going not well, or something is probably going wrong in a society if it becomes some kind of heroic activity to be or to make research or any type of science-related activity. And I think that can apply to the current events in Latin America, when one individual can be in danger just by publishing or researching on a specific topic. But as also was pointed out by Professor Antoine Buyse from Utrecht, when we have here in Belgium a virologist, Mark van Raas, that is right now in a safe place because there's some crazy guy that has threatened his life. So when it becomes heroic and you're exposing your life or patrimony or something for conducting research, is a good indicator that things probably are not going well in a society. And in that regard, if we want to speak about construction of standards, I think that the fundamental part is actually how to think about this collective element that the standards of academic freedom might look like in a region like Latin America, and most concretely inside of the Inter-American system. So by saying that, again, thanks to everyone, and obviously David, only your team. I know that I cannot see everyone, but I see Ricardo that was before me. I also see Carla Velasco, and I want to thank all the people that I'm probably not mentioning, but for all the effort that you're actually doing to go forward, that is beyond this academic event, but is something that is very meaningful, and I want to actually acknowledge that at this moment. So going back to the discussion, if we agree that we need these standards, it will be good to revisit the concept of academic freedom. So the concept of academic freedom as an idea, it starts in the 19th century. So we have universities for long ago but we have that, especially from German scholarship, you have this notion of academic freedom, this idea of academic freedom. And what is interesting is that from the beginning, this idea brings together, or is constructed as a collective space. So the idea of academic freedom was not thought in particular as an individual right, but it was thought about a collective space for the generation of knowledge. And I just want to read to you one of the paragraphs that was written by Wilhelm von Humboldt in 1809 that actually sum up this concept as it was conceived, as it was thought at that time. And he was writing, the intellectual exertions of men, the intellectual success of men, only prospers through a process of collaboration. Collaboration operates through a process in which the successful intellectual achievements of one person arouse the intellectual passions and enthusiasm of others. And so the fact that what was at first expressed only by one individual becomes a common intellectual possession instead of fading away in isolation. So these are some of the ideas that actually compose this notion of academic freedom in the 19th century. So as we can see, the notion of an individual right was not precisely in the core of the notion of the idea of academic freedom. It was the need for understanding that knowledge doesn't operate in an island. Knowledge actually operates when people actually are interacting together. And like we can see now, we are interacting on digital means and also using a transnational fashion, because we have obviously people from around the world in this event. So this collective element, in a way, has been faded away through the years. And I think that it's essential that we actually think academic freedom from this collective perspective. Why? Because at the end, this has become, and that's actually the idea that I want to bring forward to you, as a constitutional value of any society that wants to acknowledge the rule of law and the respect of human rights as the core principles for the constitution and legitimation of public authority. Why do I arrive to this conclusion? Because, as we can see, probably academic freedom as a collective good, as a collective value, as a constitutional value, is something that can prevent a regime to degrade into the spheres of authoritarianism. So one of the examples that we can see this is just on the last months when the COVID-19 emergency arose. And then we have seen how scientists around the world, and this has been documented also by Aula Abierta, are being confronted just by doing their task of actually trying to assess what is truth in these confusing times related with the COVID-19 emergency. So when this space is actually functioning well in a society, we have that becomes a filter for misinformation. And especially in our times, this becomes a control or some kind of check on the public discourses that are being circulated in a society. And we can see that when a state starts to fade away for a functional democracy to some kind of authoritarianism, one of the first yellow lights that arose are actually attacks of diverse type of attacks on academic freedom. So one of the examples, or some of the examples, have been well documented when we have these extreme cases when actually some scientists are taken to jail or they are persecuted, or some of the patterns that David also described in his presentation. But the problem here is that there's more subtle ways to actually affect the work that universities and research centers and in general academia are performing, and most of these paths are actually used through the financial means or administrative means. So if a university or if a research center is cut from different type of resources to perform this activity, then we will see that the academic activities as a whole will have problems to function in a proper manner. So for all this, how actually can we construct this? And the answer is not straightforward. So it's a continuous process. And I think that in this forum, we have several elements of how to construct. But what I want to move forward is that if we conclude, and if you follow me in regard that we can appreciate, or we can actually understand academic freedom as a constitutional value, then constitutional courts have an important saying on how these legal standards are or will be constructed. So for a legal standard to be effective, these legal standards has to be clear, and it has to be uniform applied in a specific system. So in this regard, we have seen that the role of constitutional courts is precisely defining better standards of academic freedom. What are these standards? And that's probably one of the specific problems that we are facing with this discussion. So one of the courts that have actually addressed academic freedom in depth is Ecuadorian Constitutional Court. So especially on case 920 IA from last year, the Constitutional Court went a little bit further of this concept, and it gives some lines of how to understand this concept. And one of the most important things is that the Constitutional Court of Ecuador brings some idea of what actually we should understand for academic finance standards and also administrative standards of self-government of an academic institution. So in this regard, we can see that there has to be more concrete design on financial standards of freedom of universities and research centers, also standards of self-government. And the last part of these standards, that is what was also mentioned here, standards of accountability of scientists or universities, of how they are using these collective spaces have been granted by society to them. So by saying this, we just have to highlight how important is the role of the Inter-American system to have uniform standards in this regard. Because the risk here is that if we have one constitutional court that is establishing some standards, and then these standards vary in the Inter-American system, then this standard is not uniform, and therefore it becomes less clear and less effective to defend as a regional discourse of human rights and as a regional discourse of the Inter-American system that we actually want to move forward. So in this regard, and just to conclude, there is more need to define these standards, and there is a need to have this Inter-American approach to have more uniform standards that will make the standard more clear and more easy to be followed by different sectors of society when they are going different types of scenarios, such as the rise of some authoritarian regime, or in general, some of the situations that has been highlighted in this event and in the work of Aula Abierta. So I want to finish by again, thank you, David, and thank you, Aula Abierta, for this space, and I wish you all the best for these next 2 days, and I hope that some concrete goods will be produced in regarding of the definition of these standards that are so needed on the Inter-American system. So thanks David, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Professor Gustavo Prieto, for your presentation. Please remind to leave questions on the chat window. And now our next panelist is Professor Pam Fredman. Pam Fredman is president of the International Association of Universities, and she is a former rector of the University of Gothenburg. She would talk now today on the future of universities with academic freedom perspectives.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting IAU to this conference. And I have heard very many interesting talks already about special cases and things that I can bring with me. Academic freedom is described in the concept note in a given part of human rights, and I think we agree on that, and a base for education and research and for higher education institutions to fulfill their unique role and responsibility for all societies. This was actually the background to that IAU was founded under the auspices of UNESCO 1950. At that time, universities recognized the need of a global network, a community, to maintain and extend the highest traditional concept of university life and study, and the principles of freedom and independence in research and teaching. In the 9th of December last year, IAU celebrated the 17th anniversary, and IAU is still an official partner of UNESCO and has also a statutory partnership with Council of Europe. IAU has more than 600 members, higher education institutions, and not at least many national, regional, and international higher education organizations. And through its World Higher Education Database, which is the only global higher education institution database, we reaches out to more than 20,000 higher education institutions around the world. And I mention this because this database was recently used in a study on an academic freedom index, which I will come back to. With a particular emphasis on values and leadership and acting as a forum for sharing and joint action, IAU encourages innovation, mutual learning, and cooperation among institutions. And IAU promotes core values among its members and the wider education community. And among those are academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and social responsibility, but also tolerance on divergent opinions, freedom from political interference, cooperation, and solidarity. As has been said here, the COVID-19 pandemic had an immediate and severe effect on the higher education. Almost overnight, the campuses were closed partially or completely, and education and meeting transferred online as we are doing now. And IAU performed its first survey on the consequences of the pandemic on higher education in April 2020, and the second survey is ongoing. It's not the topic of this conference to discuss the consequences of the pandemic, but they must be considered in the future of higher education, and highlights the importance of cooperation and joint actions within higher education. On the positive side, from the survey showed that although not in each country, the pandemic has increased the awareness, interest, and trust from governments, policymakers, and also in society in general, in the competence and knowledge that higher education is providing. And I see that this might help the higher education sector to promote and advocate for academic freedom, which is the base for knowledge and competence they provide. And academic freedom must remain as a core value for the future of higher education. We have to keep that all the time. The pandemic has left no one and no society behind, and has put the light on the need of global responsibility and joint actions for a sustainable future. The UN has also clearly announced that higher education is the key to equip all societies with competence and knowledge through education and research to realize Agenda 2030 and reach the 17 sustainable goals. And which, connected to what has been said, I think that education and empowering the people all around the world and in all parts of the society is a key. However, higher education institutions to fulfill the role and responsibility in societies, academic freedom must be respected and defended. And as I said, it's not an absolute, but we say freedom of each faculty to set the research agenda based on evidence, truth, and proven experience, and to communicate findings to colleagues, students, and public. And this is a prerequisite for higher education institutions to serve as public good. Academic freedom is enrolled in several statutory and policy documents, as was brought to the table by David, on national or regional and international level. And states and universities have long committed to that. But despite those documents and commitments, there is an increasing threat to academic freedom in more and more countries, as has also been said. In November last year, the European Ministers of Higher Education adopted a new communique for European higher education area. And with outspoken self-criticism to not have taken actions to the increased threats to academic freedom in some member states, the new adopted document stressed the responsibility to the commitment for each state to actively defend and support academic freedom. While academic freedom is commonly seen as crucial for fostering democratic societal development, one would ask the question, will academic freedom be a reality in non-democratic societies? Is there a catch-22? According to the reports from the Research Institute of Gothenburg University, an institute Varieties of Democracy, the world has experienced increasing autocratization in recent years. And just over a third of the world's population now lives in countries that are in a period of autocratization. In recent years, several large countries have become more autocratic. With the use of the globally collected data, the Variety of Democracy Institute, in collaboration with the Global Public Policy Institutes, recently published a paper on Academic Freedom Index, connecting to the standards we're discussing. This index was launched at a webinar with Scholars at Risk, and Robert Quinn has also, together with these authors, a follow-up paper with the title, Putting the Academic Freedom Index into Action. And since then, University World News has published several papers with pros and cons to be reflected on and debated. As been said, academic freedom is not absolute, and there is a lot of things to discuss because there are culture, epidemic, and not at least financial issues behind the academic freedom. So what to do? The higher education must take actions to improve the understanding of the relevance of academic freedom, to acquire, generate, and disseminate knowledge in society, in private and public sector, in civic society, and not at least among politicians and policymakers. Understanding of the historical proven impact of research, whose societal relevance may be decades ahead and built on curiosity and freedom to choose questions and methods. This is so obvious each year when we have the Nobel Prize award, but in between and often after that, forgotten. And I would say it's not seen in the funding system we have. Understanding of the importance of education that gives students, including lifelong learners, the academic skills to be critical, creative, and innovative. They are the transformers in all sectors of the society, including policymakers and politicians, and key actors for sustainable democratic development, with local relevance, but also with the global responsibility. 2, academic freedom must be recognized as a base for quality in higher education. Academic freedom must be a parameter in assessment of higher education institutions, including ranking system, if they have to be used. That could also be discussed. Higher education must also see to that they themselves live the value of academic freedom in their activities. It was raised before, what do you do when you have international collaboration? How do you see to the academic freedom issues? How do you see to the academic freedom issues when funders are putting pressure? Cooperation and collaboration within the higher education sector and with all stakeholders must guide the future of higher education to develop research and education and to meet the societal needs and reach Agenda 2030 and beyond. So cooperation and collaboration built on trust and respect for each other conditions and regulations, and where academic freedom is a basic condition for higher education. So finally, IAU is the global voice of higher education, but the strength and impact of the voice comes from and depends on the involvement on and engagement of its member institutions and higher education in general. IAU provides the global platform for cooperation, and we welcome you to look at our website to get more information about what we do and offer. IAU is with its core value for that members agree to, and which is part of all activities, taken actions for promoting and advocating for academic freedom. And I think that this conference is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pam Fredman, for your presentation. We have next Jesse Levine. Jesse Levine is Senior Advocacy Officer at Scholars at Risk. His talk is on global academic freedom, advocacy, and what are the stakes and what is our role.
Good morning. I'm not sure if I'm on camera. Looks like my video is stopped and I don't know if you can hear me. So I apologize. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. And then I got to start my video message just now. Hopefully I'm on camera now. Sorry for those technical difficulties. Thank you, Maida. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse Levine. I am Senior Advocacy Officer for Scholars at Risk. And I want to first thank David Gómez Gamboa, Ricardo Villalobos, and their colleagues at Aula Abierta, as well as my cherished colleague, Maida Hocevar, for their leadership in the fight for academic freedom in Venezuela and around the world. I'd also like to thank Professor Fredman for her mention of the Academic Freedom Index in the last talk and Scholars at Risk's and GPPI's work on that. That will indeed be a crucial tool in our arsenal going forward. The Scholars at Risk works to protect threatened scholars, students, and members of the higher education community around the world. We do this through direct assistance, including by arranging positions of sanctuary for scholars facing grave threats, as well as advancing understanding of academic freedom through on and off campus learning activities. And we work to respond to threats to academic freedom and advance relevant norms through our advocacy work. And that's really where we connect to this work and the subject matter of this conference. We are in a human rights space, all of us, and we've already heard worrisome stories about our colleagues and friends. And the picture of attacks on higher education around the world is going to be disturbing and sometimes heartbreaking as we hear it over the course of this conference. Indeed, while many parts of our lives have been halted during the crisis of the past year, attacks on scholars, students, and universities have certainly not. And while there's no doubt that these stories are the core reasons why we're here today, I'd like to speak a bit more about what we can do about it, where this work is going, and why, after working in this space for more than a decade, I believe that scholars, students, and the human rights community are better positioned to respond to pressures on academic freedom within institutions through national and international advocacy and in domestic and regional courts than we've ever been before. It's worth briefly mentioning, or rather reiterating, because people have mentioned them before, where the human rights standards are. What are the tools in our arsenal today that we can use to demand protections for scholars, students, and universities? Colleagues have already mentioned the legal grounding of academic freedom and the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, the right to education, and the right to the benefits of scientific progress. They've also mentioned the explication of these rights in documents like the Lima Declaration, 1997's UNESCO recommendations concerning the status of higher education teaching professionals, and general comments by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to name just a few. Each of these documents provided us with a crucial perspective on what academic freedom is and created a further foundation for development of the doctrine. But no statement to date has provided as complete and all-encompassing a concept of what academic freedom is and who it protects, as last summer's report by David Kaye, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great read and really an outstanding explication of the law and the reality. In the report, the Special Rapporteur laid out a framework for understanding academic freedom and, more important, advocating for it. That's more detailed and goes deeper than any previous statement by any international body on the subject. Among other things, it explicitly recognizes academic travel as a part of academic freedom. It recognizes extramural speech, that is speech within one's expertise, but outside the classroom or the lab, as a form of academic expression. And it recognizes student expression as an exercise of academic freedom. These are novel and important parts of the conversation, and we are very grateful to have the report as a tool in our arsenal. The Kaye report provides us with a powerful foundation for articulating local and regional standards around academic freedom, standards that are tailored to local legal systems and that center regional higher education demands and traditions. And crucially, the Special Rapporteur and his successor and other international partners have signaled their intention to do just that, to involve themselves in this work on the ground. But the reality is that no matter how good a job we do shaping the doctrine to meet local and regional needs, no matter how sharply we hone our legal standards alone are never going to get us to where we need to go. Because despite the progress we've made, it's still far too often the case that the precise definition of academic freedom is not at issue, because academic freedom is missing from the human rights conversation entirely. Attacks on scholars, students, and higher education communities are too often viewed as run-of-the-mill human rights violations, even though the facts of an individual case make clear that what motivated the attack was a desire to silence the victim's academic expression or halt their research, the defining characteristics of any attack on academic freedom. Institutions often fail to emphasize the issue of academic freedom among faculty and students, making it far more likely that violations go unaddressed. And international human rights institutions still fail far too often to acknowledge that universities stand alongside a free press, an independent judiciary, and civil society as indispensable pillars of democracy that need active and focused human rights protection. To meet these challenges, we need more than a well-developed doctrine. What we need is to ensure academic freedom as we know it is fully operationalized in global, regional, and national practices. We need to ensure that academic freedom can be meaningfully practiced everywhere, and especially in the countries that have already legally pledged themselves to respect academic freedom. We need international guidelines, not just on standards, but on implementing academic freedom in the everyday life of our universities and societies. Guidelines which cover core elements of academic freedom, such as institutional autonomy, including in governance of institutions. Guidelines that help map out how universities may achieve equitable access, including access by gender, ethnic, and religious minorities. Guidelines which go beyond legal definitions and help courts, advocates, and victims of attacks more easily identify violations of academic freedom as such when they occur. Guidelines which help universities understand their overall role in protecting academic freedom and let scholars and students know when their institutions have fallen short of their obligations. And guidelines for policymakers whose understanding of academic freedom often falls far short of what a free society demands. Once established, implementation guidelines together with improved norms would provide a roadmap for those looking to increase respect for protection for academic freedom. And they would provide a checklist against which success or failure could be assessed. So I would propose that while there is no doubt that we need to keep advancing the human rights standards, the tip of the spear is likely to be implementation. And to reach their true potential, principles of implementation and the broader effort to build recognition, protection, and ultimately a culture of academic freedom demands widespread buy-in at the institutional, state, and local levels, as well as by courts and human rights institutions. And that is an ambitious goal, I know, but we've seen unprecedented levels of interest in advancing academic freedom from within the UN, regional human rights systems, especially the inter-American and European systems, as well as from university partners around the world. Indeed, that's why we're all here, and that's why the guest list is so impressive and large at a meeting early on a Tuesday morning for all of us. I would be remiss if I didn't express my gratitude and excitement to be working with Aula Abierta and the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center on a project sponsored by the IACHR aimed at advancing academic freedom in this hemisphere. David and Ricardo have both already mentioned this work, and I think the details of this work will be announced soon. At the same time, Scholars at Risk, the University of Ottawa, the University of Monterey, and other partners, including Aula Abierta, are working on what we're calling an America's Hub, which will be geared toward not only developing human rights standards around academic freedom, but building a network of university partners throughout the hemisphere who will identify and bring test cases and advanced standards and principles of implementation on an institutional level. We're in the very early phases of that project, but the level of interest we've already seen from colleagues throughout the Americas is beyond promising. At bottom, this work is about more than top-down standards. It's about helping to empower our colleagues in the spaces where they live and work, study and teach, to live the values that not only sustain the university space, but advance free societies everywhere. I am excited to have this many colleagues joining this effort and would welcome the opportunity to share more with you. I can be reached at jl4289@nyu.edu. And you can reach Scholars at Risk in that way. And once again, thank you so much to Aula Abierta for holding this very important conference and to your continued partnership and to the amazing energy that you bring to this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Carla Fredman, professor at the University of Gent, member of the Council of Europe's Expert Council on NGO Law. She's going to talk about academic freedom challenges in Europe. Thank you very much, Professor Fredman.
Hello, my name is Carla Fredman. I am an academic in the School of Law at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. It's a great pleasure to be with you, even remotely, at this very important conference and the important process that you're working on in terms of academic freedom violations, trying to chart the way forward. What I'll try to talk about is the relationship between academic freedom violations and violations of human rights, and for the most egregious cases, violations of criminal law and international criminal law provisions. So starting with why we should be concerned about the violation of academic freedom, we should be concerned because of what it says about the wider rights in society, particularly freedom of expression and freedom of association. When certain speech acts are criminalized or otherwise not allowed to take place, this will impact freedom of expression and create a climate of fear and self-censorship. This often happens when governments are not prepared to allow debate, to challenge official versions of events, or when certain types of speech are prevented in order to stifle debate on controversial subjects. We can think of the recent incident in which two renowned Holocaust researchers were ordered by a Polish court in Warsaw to apologize to a plaintiff who sued them for defaming her uncle. The academics had called out the uncle for crimes perpetrated during the Holocaust. The court also indicated that the academics, by their work, had damaged national identity and national pride. When students are unable to meet, to form groups, to discuss issues that concern them, this impacts also freedom of assembly. At times, student groups will be banned. There can be brutal, violent crackdowns against student protest movements. Government security agents in many countries have used lethal force to disperse student protesters with deadly consequences. Students who are part of unauthorized groups will commit an academic offense, which might lead to students being reprimanded or suspended or even kicked out of universities, or potentially they can be reported to the police for a crime and thereafter prosecuted. Violations of academic freedom are also important for what they do to access to knowledge. Academic freedom violations put pressure on universities so that certain subjects are not taught, certain academics are not permitted to teach, students are afraid to enroll in certain courses or universities. So examples of this are the recent crackdowns against academics by the Chinese government. China had banned certain foreign academics from entering the country and working with Chinese academic institutions for allegedly spreading malicious lies and disinformation related to the mass persecution of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China. Numerous Chinese academics have been victims of crackdowns on academic freedom themselves. So domestically, we can see that this is a phenomenon which happens quite frequently. Academic freedom violations are also significant for how they can target particular persons or groups, whether it's student groups, academics perceived to be associated with particular political movements or causes, for a range of other additional human rights violations. So beyond freedom of expression, beyond freedom of association, and beyond the right to education, academic freedom violations lead to, cause, contribute to a range of additional violations, such as arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, extrajudicial executions. Students and teachers, often amongst the most politically active elements of society, are frequent victims of human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings and arbitrary arrest. Cases of researchers who go abroad to carry out research have surfaced in which they often run into serious problems. Cases I have in my mind are the case of Giulio Regeni from Italy, whose brutal abduction, torture, and murder in Egypt shocked the conscience of the academic community. I can also think of Kylie Moore-Gilbert from Australia and Jiji Wang, permanent residents in the United States, but from China. Both of them were prolonged, arbitrarily detained in Iran for issues connected, at least in principle, to their research. But even more so, domestic academics, researchers, and students face massive and very frequent abuses in a wide array of countries. Coming a little bit closer to home in relation to this conference, one can think, of course, of the abuses in the 70s and 80s in Latin America, in particular the Operation Condor, which had a massive impact on students, student groups, professors who were perceived to be affiliated with certain political parties and not which were perceived to be against the interests of the governments, with large number of individuals subjected to torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions. Additionally, other types of violations include targeting, surveillance, and reporting on students and professors perceived to be associated with particular causes, which can lead to reactionary, toxic institutions where students are reporting on other students, professors are monitoring students and other professors. This, of course, is the antithesis of learning and has a massive impact on the right to education. In the United Kingdom, the government's PREVENT program required academics to report on students who might potentially be at risk of Islamic radicalization. This had a chilling effect on groups who were perceived to discuss issues relating to terrorism, counterterrorism, and groups which had a predominantly Muslim affiliation were perceived to be at risk of these types of measures. Additionally, loss of jobs and job security. Academics who speak their minds are often fired from state institutions, from state universities. Look no further than the case of Turkey, where vast numbers of academics were fired for signing the Academics for Peace Declaration and for perceived affiliations with anti-government groups. You can also think of the arrest of Sudanese biology professor Farouk Mohammed for teaching the theory of evolution under the prior regime in Sudan. But there can be challenges in countries with much stronger records for human rights protection. So even in Canada, at the University of Toronto, the university was accused of rescinding a job offer to an academic because of her perceived support of Palestinian causes. When academic freedom violations are widespread or systematic, they can, at least in principle, amount to persecution as a crime against humanity. And this is something I'll turn to next. So persecution means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or the collectivity. So the International Criminal Court elements of crimes provide the following elements for the crime of persecution, including the mental element. So firstly, the perpetrator severely deprived, contrary to international law, one or more persons of fundamental rights. So even from my very brief remarks and the cases I listed, one can see that the notion that one or more persons' fundamental rights have been violated would not be a difficult hurdle to overcome. The next category, the perpetrator targeted such persons by reason of the identity of a group or collectivity, or targeted the group or collectivity as such. So here, once again, academics, students who are connected in some sort of way as a group or a collectivity, one could see that academic freedom violations target them specifically. And the next requirement is that the targeting has to be based on a political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender type of basis or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law. So when we think of academic freedom violations, the whole panoply of violations that we've been discussing, one could say that possibly the targeting may have been based on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or other type of criteria, but it would really depend on the context. The targeting of academics as such would not necessarily fall within this category. But if they're targeted because of their perceived political affiliations, or because a student group has a particular racial, national, or ethnic makeup, and they're targeted because of that, then that could fit within the category. And then finally, the conduct must have been committed in connection with any act referred to in Article 7, Paragraph 1 of the International Criminal Court Statute. So Article 7, Paragraph 1 refers to the different types of crimes that form the basis for a crime against humanity. So there's a long list of crimes, and they include things like murder, torture, arbitrary detention, rape and other sexual offenses, enforced disappearances. So when considering academic freedom violations, the types of offenses that they refer to are broad in their nature, but the types of offenses for the crime of persecution are more circumscribed. So we're not necessarily talking about violations of freedom of expression or violations of freedom of association, but with respect to academic freedom violations, one can certainly refer to the impact of the crimes which produce widespread or systematic acts of torture, arbitrary detention, or other types of crimes. So we do have that connection potentially, depending on the context. For a crime against humanity to exist, it must either be widespread. So looking at, for instance, academic freedom violations in Turkey, if we take Turkey as an example, the widespread detention of academics in the thousands, one could argue that that amounted to widespread. Systematic, and it's either or, doesn't need to be both. So widespread or systematic. Systematic refers to the degree of government or other official planning or organization. And here, in most of the cases that I've referred to, and there are many more, of course, that degree of planning or organization is most certainly present. So certainly, just to conclude, it's fair to say that academic freedom violations most certainly can amount not only to serious violations of human rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to education, but also they lead to a whole panoply of human rights violations, including torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and the list goes on. Where those violations are particularly targeted against a political or other group, and they are widespread or systematic, it can also be argued that in those types of circumstances, we may be dealing with an act of persecution as a crime against humanity. So to conclude, these are serious matters. They require our concerted attention, and it's important that we give them the due regard that they need in order that we can ensure that they can be prevented and that we can ensure that these acts do not continue. Thank you.
Those were the words of Professor Carla Fredman. She is a lecturer of international criminal law at University of Essex. Professor Fredman couldn't join us on live due to labor compromises. However, as you saw, she managed to share with us an open-eye presentation on egregious human rights violations against students and professors and its relation with international crimes, in which academic freedom could be involved. And following her comments, I would like to underline that in the worst cases, some academic freedom violations could be closely connected to practices that amount international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, regarding the wording of the Rome Statute. So I think it's really important to have this in mind. Now, it's time to close our panel. It has been amazing with some really important comments about, I think, the most authoritative authors in the field. I know we have more, but this has been really amazing. So, but now it's time to answer some of the questions that have been posed by our attendees today. So the first question is directed to Professor Antoine. And the question is related with the Declaration on Academic Freedom of Utrecht. The question is, what has been the impact of this declaration, not only in state actors, but also the academic community and the private sector? I have another question that is related to Professor Antoine. I'm going to mention it, and then I can reread it if it's needed. So it says, congratulations to all panelists and the organizers. I study academic freedom in Brazil. Many cases of researchers harassed by corporations due to the results of their studies, which can damage the image and operations of these corporations. She says, or he says, besides the violation of academic freedom from authoritarian states, as happens in Brazil nowadays too, due to Bolsonaro government, I would like to hear from the panelists about the role of corporation in violation of academic freedom in their countries. So this is a question that could be also open. It's not only for Professor Antoine. I made a mistake.
Thank you, Chair. And to go into these two questions on possible effects of the Utrecht Declaration, well, as I said, words don't change the world automatically. What I think it did is to galvanize awareness about this issue. If you talk to outsiders not working in universities, they will say, well, academic freedom is not the most important human right. Please care about others first. And of course, there are lots of other very essential human rights. But as we also heard from the other speakers today, some violations of academic freedom are really severe, and they affect not only individuals, but also entire institutions. So this is also the collective element. And I think the awareness has really grown in the last 5 years, not because of that declaration, but because of everything that has happened in the world. So having these declarations and also these norms now on paper gives us a language to talk about it, which is similar to the function also of human rights in general. We now have kind of frameworks to assess the very grave injustices against. So that would be my question and my answer to the first question. On the second one, on the role of corporations, of businesses, I think what we have really seen is that businesses already from the 1980s onwards have discovered that universities' academic research can be used for their own agendas. And they have done so to positive, but also very negative effects. A good example is the climate change debate, of course, where the whole word of climate change has been pushed by businesses, and they have paid academics to start using it in reports. And the same in a different field, in the tobacco industry, there was also research done which said that it was not as dangerous, and now we know it's the opposite. So businesses have from the start used knowledge institutions to further their claims, whether we look at a TV commercial which says this food is healthy, this is proven, academically proven, or whether it's very serious things. So I think whenever academics engage with businesses, they should, their institution should protect them against pressures. So any contract for doing research should be very clear about the academic independence. And if there are, like what the question asker said, like in Brazil, direct threats even from business on academic work, that's of course even worse. So there, again, the institution should also protect the individual researchers and research groups, not just out of solidarity, but also very practically. These are their staff that they should protect. So this is what I mentioned in my talk about the responsibility of the universities to protect their own staff. So that would be my answer.
Excellent. Other question, this one is an open question, and also there is a room if any of the other speakers want to build on this issue about the private sector. But there is another question that is related to what are the next standards on international advocacy in Latin America, and this one was directed to David Gómez. And the other question we received is, what will be the standards and how to prioritize them if it's needed to make any prioritization, elaborating the standards? And this is an open question. Okay, Professor Pam raised her hand. So after, okay.
Give the floor to Professor Pam, and after that we can share some comments.
I would like to go to the previous question first about cooperation and how to deal with that. And as I said, I think that it's a necessity that the faculties get the power and get the support for standing up for the academic freedom. I mean, there is a lot of collaboration with business. We have to do that. We have to work with private and public sectors because that's the only way we can develop things and develop questions and knowledge. But we have to do it on the premises for each actor's legislations and regulations. And in that case, academic freedom is the right for the academics, and they should protect that. If they don't live that, I mean, we can see several cases where you put a lot of money on the table, but the researchers will be there and they will not consider all the time what concerns there are behind this. So I will really encourage everyone to, through cooperation, we can be strong. And I think that also the business sector will listen to us if we are cooperating. And many international business companies, they see the value of this now. So I think that is very important. We have to live the values all the time. And then I think with the standards and indicators and so on, Jesse said very clearly that the implementation of living this, that's the most important thing, to get the understanding, because there is no definition of academic freedom. But I think that we all have the notion of what we mean, and implementations within the sector and with help from the external partners. I think it's so important. Otherwise, we will not win this battle.
Brilliant. Okay, David, I think you can continue. And then I have Professor Jose Gustavo Prieto.
I prefer to give the floor to Professor Gustavo because maybe his comment is directly linked to the first question.
Oh, you're there. So yeah, I just have like two remarks. The first one related to the standards question. There was also a question that was addressed by Bismarck Ortiz Rondon from Venezuela, and he makes a very good point about the standards that is the core of this panel, right? He mentioned the institutional dimension for standards to flourish. So even if, and I think that he's referring to Venezuela case, even if academic freedom is recognized on constitutional text, then if the institutional framework crushes all type of rights, then these standards cannot flourish. I think I understood his question in this regard. And I think that that's one of the prerequisites of standards. We need to have this balance between powers and rights. And that's something that is very common in Latin America for the last 200 years, because we have these constitutions where the Bill of Rights are even more expansive. So we can see that on the Constitution of Venezuela, but you will find that on the Constitution of Ecuador and Bolivia, when you have a Bill of Rights that is extremely extensive. But if the power is concentrated on the executive, then the power will be eaten these rights, these extensive Bill of Rights that they are established on the Constitution. For that reason, my idea was in the sense that constitutional courts are the ones that are called to actually give forms inside of the institutional setting of a country to these standards, to make this Bill of Rights that contains even these standards on the new constitutions alive. So I just wanted to make this point to connect it with the standard questions. And with the question about private, we can say also the relation between private power and academia is really challenging, especially if you look to the development of the digital economy. So right now we have a lot of issues regarding lawmaking processes of new technologies such as blockchain and artificial intelligence. So I think that the idea will be to actually put a special attention on these hybrid zones when these new technologies are creating spaces where both academia and private sector and also public officials are coexisting. So just to give you an example, right now there are specific discussions about the standards that are used on artificial intelligence to prevent some kind of human rights impact on the way that algorithms are performing in some programs such as Facebook and so on. So in this case, we can see that who are drafting these standards are a mix between academics, private sector, and sometimes public officials that they are in bodies like the IEEE or the ISO discussing these matters. So I think that in this part, one challenge is to see how these develop between the private sector and academia in these standard setting bodies. And I think that's one of the challenges for academia and freedom, on academic freedom, to see how these new debates of technology are internalized and this equilibrium between private and public is built in these hybrid zones. So thanks a lot for this space.
Thank you, Gustavo. Regarding the question about the next step on the advocacy work in favor of academic freedom in Latin America, I should say that this is a civic society space task. And so I would like to encourage the different actors from the human rights institutes, from the different universities, and from the different NGOs which are connected with this matter to try to work on the matter. For example, we are trying to produce in a coalition different reports after a documentation process on the situation of academic freedom in the different countries in Latin America. So the different institutions are invited to give their inputs on that. And specifically on the international advocacy work, as David Cale and the new rapporteur of the United Nations on freedom of expression mentioned in the very important report that was produced last year, we should address submissions invoking the grounds on academic freedom when the cases are related to that. Before the treaty bodies of the United Nations, but also before the special mechanisms, we have the presence in this conference of different rapporteurs on the United Nations who are interested on the situation, on the relationship of academic freedom with other fundamental rights. So it's a way to try to put the subject, the matter on the table, as we say in Spanish. And of course, before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, as it is obvious because this conference is sponsored by the Redesca, the rapporteur on the rights, economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights, there is a special interest on the matter. So we should address our reports, our claims, our denounces, our requests to the international bodies on human rights. And so we would like to work together. I think this common collaborative work is a key issue to try to go to the next steps. I would like to say that we are working with SARS, Corosatris, the University of Ottawa Human Rights Centers, and different Latin American universities in a coalition with Aula Abierta in the production of a debate on the minimum standards on academic freedom before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And so every one of you and every one of your institutions are welcome to help us to try to discuss and participate in the debate of that. 2 weeks ago, the rapporteur on freedom of expression of the Inter-American Commission developed a debate on some draft standards, principles on academic freedom, and we contributed to this discussion saying that it's very important that those principles should determine the subjects under protection of academic freedom as human right. It's desirable to have at least a broad definition and scope of academic freedom. I think we should contribute in those principles with the definitions about the indirect violations on academic freedom, as there is a very good content on the indirect violations of freedom of expression. We should also do any kind of emphasis in the intersectional scope and focus of academic freedom and its link with other fundamental freedoms as freedom of association, as freedom of expression, the right to education as well. We should work in the definition of the inclusive university, a university which is open and welcoming to the women, for example, and in which the violence against women or the discrimination against LGTB groups or any person vulnerable, of course, it could be welcome in the university, and the principles should also make a definition about and a content about the limits and restrictions on academic freedom, because academic freedom should be, of course, limited, and autonomy of the universities as well. So thank you.
Okay, David, I want to give the floor to Jesse, which wants also to talk about this question.
Yeah, and actually, thank you, Ricardo. I had my hand raised, but largely I'm echoing what David had to say. I think it's crucial that we all of us here and all of us in this movement conceive of our work as grassroots work, right? This is fundamentally about empowering our colleagues in all over the world who understand more about what's going on locally, what the pressures are on their institutions, what their institutional needs are, and how to develop them. So I think as a group, we have a lot of sort of top-end knowledge. We understand the standards, we can make the legal arguments, but implementing the kind of lived values is really, I think, a big part of our task. And that's why so much of this work is about networking. Even, as much as it is about legal standards, as much as it is about the intellectual exercise, it's about simply getting people to begin thinking about these issues in their own lives, on their own campuses, in their own homes. So, I think that's a job that every one of us can contribute to. I think every panelist touched on that issue, and I hope that it's, that we continually articulate that to ourselves. That's it. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you, Ricardo.
Brilliant, Jesse. We have many more questions, but I have to say that in sake of time, we need to move forward. But I would like to encourage you to bear with us during the conference, because many of the questions are related to the presentations that other speakers are going to do throughout all the conference, including special rapporteurs, which is the presentation I would like to introduce to close this panel, which has been amazing. I want to reinforce that message. So now it's time to listen the message to the Mr. Clément Boulet, who is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Assembly, Peaceful Assembly and Association of the United Nations, who's going to talk about those rights and its relation with academic freedom.
Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to connect with you today. Thank you to Aula Abierta and the Autonomous University of Mexico for inviting me to speak at this important event. Academic freedom and institutional autonomy are critical elements of the healthy functioning of democratic society and the maintenance of a vibrant civic space. By advancing learning, teaching, and research, free and autonomous universities contribute every day to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. This is especially true when these institutions work with and contribute to improving the lives of the communities around them. While there is no explicit protection for institutional autonomy or academic freedom in the text of the core UN human rights treaties, international standards relevant to autonomy and academic freedom are rooted in the right to education, right to freedom of expression, the right to peaceful assembly, freedom of association, and the right to movement or travel. As expressed by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, academic freedom protects the rights of the members of the academic community, including individuals and groups, to pursue, develop, and transmit knowledge and ideas with the goal of improving our societies. These include the right to express opinion about the institution or system in which they work, as well as the right to form and participate in professional association or representative academic bodies without discrimination or fear of repression. The right to association, in particular, is essential to the realization of institutional autonomy or effective self-governance. For a university to be autonomously governed, students and teachers must be free to form union and association, and this body must be able to function without undue restriction. Any limits on freedom of association and peaceful assembly must be based on legitimate ground, including the protection of the rights of others. Restriction cannot be pursued to advance a single political ideology and stifle dissent. In my years as a rapporteur, I have received many reports of legal and extra-legal measures affecting university autonomy and academic freedom that violates the right to peaceful assembly and of association. These include measures that unduly interfere with governance structure, including weakening the independence of student bodies and academic associations. My mandate has documented thousands of students in prison for exercising their right to expression, association, and assembly in campus, which often face militarization. In Honduras, for example, students protesting university reform were arrested and subject to long criminal procedures under charges of trespassing and illegal assembly. Criminalizing academics for expressing their opinion, organizing and participating in peaceful assembly is also on the rise. This not affects the individual and academic life, but can have a serious chilling effect on the public debates in the country. The extensive criminalization of academic and university staff in Turkey following the attempt coup in 2016 is perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of these trends. The use of foreign agents to undermine the legitimacy of foreign-based institutions and academic is also a great concern of my mandate. I'm also concerned about how situation of national emergency, including COVID-19 related emergency decrees, can be used by governments to impose undue restriction on universities and curtail their autonomy. In conclusion, the future of democracy is at risk in the absence of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. That is why we have to do more to ensure students and academics can fully and freely enjoy their right to peaceful assembly and association as essential components of academic freedom and university autonomy. My mandate is committed to support students and scholar union and movements and push back against these trends. I hope you have a fruitful discussion during this conference. And I'm sorry, I'm not able to be with you today due to some constraints. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Those were the and Association of the United Nations. And I think something that it's worthy to mention is how he acknowledged formally the relationship between academic freedom and the freedom of peaceful assembly, but also association. And it's also something that we like to highlight is like we will have more rapporteurs throughout all the conference, and they are going to be making this relationship, underscoring the relationship between academic freedom and other fundamental rights, but also academic freedom and economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, in the words of the rapporteur Soledad García Muñoz from the Inter-American System. This panel has come to an end. I would like to say thank you to everybody again, all the experts, but also all the attendees. And I would like to encourage you to continue with us. The next session will be held in Spanish. And it's going to be about a general vision of academic freedom. So I hope you enjoy this one. And also I hope you enjoy the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Maida, for being co-host of this panel. Thanks to Professor Antoine Buyse, to Professor José Gustavo Prieto, to Professor Pam Fredman, to Professor Jesse Levine, and to Professor Carla Firstman, and special thanks to the rapporteur of the United Nations on Freedom of Association, Mr. Clement Boulet, for this special message made to this conference. Next panel is beginning in some minutes, in 5 minutes, but before we are playing a video that we prepared for you to connect this panel to the next one. Thanks to all, and thanks to our panelists. Professor Pablo Riveri is beginning the next panel at 11:30. Thank you very much. Saludos cordiales. Esperamos 4 minutos exactamente para empezar el siguiente panel, titulado Visión General de la Libertad Académica y Autonomía Universitaria en Latinoamérica. Queremos agradecer infinitamente a todos y todas las participantes en esta primera sesión de la Conferencia Internacional por la Libertad Académica hacia la construcción de estándares internacionales en la materia. Ese primer panel fue desarrollado en inglés. Tuvimos a un panel selecto, un lujo, un honor tener como panelistas a quienes nos han precedido y continuamos la conferencia internacional justamente en 4 minutos con el siguiente panel que va a ser desarrollado en inglés. Quien introduce ese panel será el profesor Pablo Riveri, ya conectado. Luego la profesora Elba Jiménez Solares de la Universidad Autónoma de México. Luego el profesor José Raúl Gallego. Luego el profesor Joaquín Mejía Rivero. Le sigue la profesora Inés Faría. Le sigue luego el profesor Marco Valdivieso y finaliza dentro del staff de ponentes la profesora Carelia Hidalgo. Profesores de distintas latitudes latinoamericanas, de distintos estados, que van a compartir con todas y todos sus experiencias, sus investigaciones en materia de la libertad académica según sus perspectivas específicamente vinculadas a los países de los cuales tienen nacionalidad o han investigado o han vivido, han tenido experiencias académicas. Ya en 3 minutos estaríamos iniciando. Yo aprovecho este breve intermedio para ratificar que el tiempo de exposición para cada panelista es de aproximadamente 10 minutos y para ratificar que a los y las participantes que cumplan la asistencia en relación a la jornada del día de hoy, a la jornada del día de mañana, se les extenderá una certificación de participación. Tenemos por allí algunos videos, les doy pues el derecho al equipo técnico a aprovechar estos 2 minutos para poder transmitir, si hubiera alguno ya en la lista de los pendientes, para aprovecharlos. La moderación del siguiente panel fundamentalmente está a cargo de 2 colegas extraordinarios, además, que representan a 2 instituciones con las cuales hemos desarrollado un trabajo colaborativo a lo largo de por lo menos un quinquenio o más, por lo menos desde el 2014, 2 instituciones venezolanas, el Centro para la Paz y los Derechos Humanos de nuestra hermana Universidad Central de Venezuela, el profesor Juan Carlos Barreto, y el Centro de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad Metropolitana, a cargo de su directora, la profesora Andrea Santa Cruz. Luego en 1 minuto los presento, pero como los veo conectados, pues no puedo evitar la tentación de saludarles. No sé si el equipo técnico quiere aprovechar para poner el video de cierre del panel anterior para entonces empezar el siguiente panel ya en 1 minuto, o el video se va a transmitir de seguidas iniciando el siguiente panel.
Estudiantes y jóvenes venezolanos en el último periodo de sesiones de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos que se llevó a cabo en Haití. Recibí esta invitación a participar por el equipo Aula Abierta.
El movimiento estudiantil venezolano ha sido víctima de una política sistemática y generalizada de criminalización de la protesta a lo largo de la última década. Según cifras elaboradas en conjunto con Aula Abierta, solo del 23 de enero al 1 de mayo del 2019, al menos 41 estudiantes universitarios fueron detenidos arbitrariamente en el marco de las jornadas de protesta pacífica que fueron convocadas por la Asamblea Nacional.
Como tal, pues era una experiencia completamente nueva para mí. Yo había viajado ya a la Asamblea General de la OEA a reunirme con el secretario general Luis Almagro para hablarle sobre el estado de las universidades, pero nunca había participado en una audiencia y tuvo la incidencia internacional que yo esperaba. Todos los comisionados, todos los asistentes de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil de Latinoamérica que se hicieron presentes en Haití para ese periodo de sesiones se enteraron de las graves violaciones al derecho a la educación, libertad académica y autonomía universitaria que se viven actualmente en Venezuela. Para mí fue una alegría increíble poder representar no solamente a los estudiantes venezolanos, sino a todos los jóvenes que han tenido que dejar de estudiar por las circunstancias o que han tenido que emigrar en busca de oportunidades y que se han quedado sin eso tan preciado y tan necesario, no solamente para el crecimiento de un país, sino para el crecimiento individual de cada uno de nosotros, que es la formación y la educación que brindan nuestras universidades actualmente. El mensaje a todo el estudiantado es que tengamos plena certeza de que nuestra voz está siendo escuchada, que estamos llegando lejos, que hay muchísimos jóvenes, no solamente yo, y estudiantes que están dando la pelea y que están teniendo en espacios de incidencia internacional la oportunidad de denunciar lo que tú no puedes hacer.
Desde el movimiento estudiantil holandino agradecemos a las distintas organizaciones defensoras de los derechos humanos de nuestro país, organizaciones como Aula Abierta, el Observatorio de Derechos Humanos de nuestra ilustre Universidad de los Andes, por habernos permitido participar en la audiencia de la Comisión Interamericana de los Derechos Humanos, por haber permitido que la voz del movimiento estudiantil holandino se escuchara y que pudiéramos nosotros reflejar y denunciar las injusticias de este régimen que quiere acabar con la autonomía universitaria y con la libertad académica. Esperamos poder seguir haciendo un enlace desde el movimiento estudiantil para seguir denunciando estas irregularidades y para seguir defendiendo a las instituciones educativas de nuestro país.
Las acciones con incidencia internacional por la libertad académica han significado un gran apoyo para el trabajo de visibilizar la situación que hoy viven nuestras universidades, pero además ha servido para que jóvenes como yo podamos ser los voceros de esta situación, permitiendo generar un contacto directo con actores internacionales que no solamente han escuchado nuestro mensaje, sino que también ha permitido generar un intercambio de ideas y de experiencias, que sin duda ha fortalecido nuestro rol de líder en el país y además ha permitido que el movimiento estudiantil venezolano sea reconocido en el mundo por la lucha que seguimos emprendiendo en defensa de la academia.
Estudiantes, siempre será un honor poder compartir con la comunidad internacional qué pasa en nuestras universidades y todas las luchas que hemos tenido que librar para defender la autonomía y la libertad académica. No hace mucho tuvimos la oportunidad, varios representantes estudiantiles, de denunciar ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos todo lo que estaba aconteciendo en nuestras universidades y cómo la dictadura se ha empeñado en quitarnos lo poco que nos queda y en la asfixia presupuestaria. Y es para nosotros grato poder tener un escenario donde poder levantar la voz y denunciar todo este tipo de hechos que violentan y que repercuten en la vida de cada joven venezolano. Y para nosotros siempre es un honor también decirles que no nos vamos a rendir y que todos los días nos motivamos a salir adelante y a no dejar que otras personas nos roben nuestros sueños.
Los estudiantes y los jóvenes defensores venezolanos hemos logrado alzar la voz por nuestras universidades ante todos los países del mundo. Logramos que la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y la Organización de las Naciones Unidas hablaran de la libertad académica y los atropellos a la autonomía universitaria no solamente como un problema de Venezuela, sino como un problema de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas y la CIDH. Por eso hoy, los jóvenes y los estudiantes seguimos luchando para seguir haciendo incidencia internacional y lograr que haya justicia en defensa de nuestras universidades.
En febrero del 2020, ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que visitó a la ciudad de Cúcuta para conocer la grave situación de todos los venezolanos, también tuvimos la oportunidad de denunciar esta violación a la autonomía universitaria.